The company party was in full swing, with laughter and clinking glasses filling the grand ballroom. Mark stepped in, his heart pounding in his chest, though not from excitement. The weight of the envelope in his pocket felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried before. It wasn't just a letter. It was his way out of the nightmare he had been living. Mark's eyes scanned the room, and there she was, Sarah, his wife. She looked stunning in a sleek red dress that hugged her figure. Her laughter echoed above the music, carefree and vibrant, but it wasn't him making her laugh. Standing close, too close, was her boss, Josh. Tall, polished, and exuding a smug confidence, Josh leaned into Sarah, whispering something that made her giggle like a schoolgirl. Mark froze, his pulse quickening. As he edged closer through the crowd, his worst fears crystallized into reality. Sarah's hand was resting on Josh's chest, fingers lightly grazing the fabric of his expensive blazer. The intimate exchange was undeniable, their body language speaking volumes that words never could. His chest tightened. A mix of betrayal and anger churned within him, but beneath it all was a cold resolve. He had prepared for this moment. He wouldn't let the emotions consume him. He had a plan, and now it was time to act. Mark approached with steady steps, his face calm, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. As he reached them, their laughter faltered. Sarah's head turned, her smile fading as she met his eyes. Josh straightened, his charm flickering into unease. Without breaking stride, Mark pulled the envelope from his pocket and handed it to Sarah. "You might want to read this before the night ends," he said. His voice steady and unervingly calm. The room seemed to shrink around them. Sarah's face drained of color, her fingers trembling as she took the letter. Josh stood frozen, his smirk wiped clean. Mark didn't wait for a response. With a nod, he turned and walked away, his heart beating steadily now. He didn't need to stay to witness the fallout. He had already won. The weight was gone, and for the first time in weeks, he felt free. Just a few weeks ago, Mark would have laughed at the idea of his life unraveling so completely. He had been a man deeply in love, proud of his wife and the life they had built together. Sarah was everything to him, his partner, his confidant, his dream for the future. They had met a decade earlier, and their connection felt unshakable, rooted in trust and shared ambitions. But cracks had started to form in that picture-perfect life. It was subtle at first. Sarah began spending more time at work, coming home later than usual. When she was home, she was distant, glued to her phone with vague excuses about work emails. Mark brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the stress of her job. Then came the moment that shattered his illusions. One evening, Sarah left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to shower. It buzzed with a notification, and out of reflex, Mark glanced at it. His heart dropped. It was a message from Josh, her boss, and it wasn't the kind of professional exchange you'd expect. "Can't stop thinking about last night. You looked stunning in that dress." Mark's mind raced. His first instinct was denial. There had to be an explanation. But as the days went on, the signs became impossible to ignore. The late nights, the secretive texts, the sudden distance between them, it all pointed to the same conclusion. Disbelief gave way to heartbreak, a searing pain that kept him awake at night. He wanted to confront Sarah immediately, to demand answers, but something stopped him. Instead of lashing out, he decided to uncover the full truth. He needed evidence, not just for closure, but to ensure there would be no room for denial or manipulation when the moment came to confront her. Mark became methodical. He checked their shared phone records and pieced together a timeline of Sarah's interactions with Josh. He started paying attention to her phone conversations, her hushed tone when she mentioned work events. He even overheard a brief exchange between Sarah and a coworker that confirmed her growing closeness to Josh. It hurt to watch the woman he loved betray him, but with every piece of evidence, his resolve grew. He wasn't going to be the blind, naive husband. He deserved better, and he would make sure Sarah knew that. Sitting alone late one night, Mark wrote the separation letter. It wasn't an angry rant. It was a carefully worded statement of his decision. He outlined what he had discovered, how deeply it had hurt him, and why he could no longer stay in a marriage built on lies. As he folded the letter and tucked it into an envelope, Mark felt a strange calm. The pain was still there, but now it was joined by a sense of purpose. He wouldn't let Sarah's betrayal define him. He was ready to reclaim his life, and the company party would be the perfect stage to deliver his message. Mark was the kind of man who seemed unshakable, calm, collected, and deeply loyal. His entire life revolved around building a secure and loving home for Sarah and himself. He wasn't flashy or overly romantic, but his actions always spoke louder than words. Mark believed in trust, stability, and the quiet strength of commitment. But beneath that composed exterior lay a deeply emotional person. When Sarah's betrayal began to surface, it hit Mark like a freight train. The pain was overwhelming, but instead of letting it consume him, he channeled it into purpose. His loyalty didn't blind him to reality. Once he saw the truth, he refused to ignore it. Mark's calculating nature became his shield. While his heart was breaking, his mind stayed focused on finding the answers he needed. Each piece of evidence he gathered was another step toward reclaiming his dignity. Mark wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. He wanted closure. And once he made his decision to end the marriage, he was unflinching. For Mark, betrayal was the one thing he could not forgive. Sarah had always been the life of the party. Charming, ambitious, and magnetic. She had a natural ability to draw people in, and her confidence was one of the things that first attracted Mark to her. But Sarah's charm hid a side of her that was easily swayed by external validation. Over time, Sarah had grown restless in their marriage. Mark's long hours at work and his pragmatic approach to life left her feeling overlooked. She loved the stability he provided, but deep down, she craved excitement and attention. Something that Mark, absorbed in providing a secure future, wasn't always able to give. Josh was a storm in her otherwise predictable world. He complimented her in ways that Mark didn't, made her feel seen and desired. For Sarah, the thrill of their secret connection outweighed the guilt she felt about betraying her husband. It wasn't love. It was an escape from the monotony she had convinced herself she was trapped in. She didn't realize the depth of the damage she was causing until it was too late. Josh was the type of man who radiated confidence and power. He thrived on his ability to manipulate situations and people to his advantage. As Sarah's boss, he had a natural position of authority, and he used it to subtly chip away at her insecurities. Josh was sharp and calculated, knowing exactly how to say the right things to draw Sarah closer. He wasn't interested in her as a person. To him, she was a conquest, a way to flex his dominance both at work and socially. He knew the risk of getting involved with a married employee but dismissed it as inconsequential. For Josh, everything was a game and he played to win. He didn't anticipate that Mark, the quiet and unassuming husband, would be the one to turn the tables. When the confrontation came, Josh's confidence was shaken, revealing the shallow, self-serving nature behind his charm. The company party was a glittering affair, held in the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel. The chandeliers sparkled above the crowd, their golden light reflecting off champagne flutes and sequin dresses. Laughter and conversation filled the room, accompanied by the soft strains of a live jazz band. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and indulgence. Mark stood at the edge of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd. The hum of conversation barely registered in his ears. His focus was singular. Sarah. She was at the center of the room, her red dress catching the light as she moved. Mark's heart tightened as he watched her laugh, her head tilted slightly toward Josh. There it was again. A stolen glance, a moment of whispered conversation. Josh leaned in, his hand resting lightly on Sarah's back. Mark's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He had seen enough. This wasn't an innocent interaction between colleagues. Their chemistry was undeniable, and the betrayal was on full display, right in front of him. As Sarah laughed at something Josh said, her hand rested briefly on his chest, fingers tracing the lapel of his blazer. Mark felt a surge of anger, hot and bitter, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had waited weeks for this moment. The separation letter in his pocket was folded neatly, a tangible reminder of his decision. His fingers brushed against it, tightening as he steadied his breathing. The night played out around him, the crowd oblivious to the tension simmering in his corner. Mark kept his movements deliberate, circling the room with a drink in his hand, always keeping Sarah and Josh in his peripheral vision. He wanted the perfect moment, not to explode, but to make a statement. That moment came when their laughter grew louder, drawing attention from nearby guests. Mark approached with quiet steps, cutting through the sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits. Sarah's laughter faltered when she noticed him, her face turning toward him with a mix of surprise and unease. Josh, on the other hand, didn't flinch, his smirk growing as if daring Mark to speak. Mark didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope, holding it out to Sarah. "You might want to read this before the night ends," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, though laced with an edge that couldn't be missed. Sarah's eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly as she took the envelope. "Mark, what is this?" she stammered, her voice barely audible above the music. Josh's smirk faltered, his brow furrowing as he glanced between them. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, but the confidence in his tone wavered. Mark's gaze didn't shift to Josh. He kept his eyes on Sarah, his expression unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied coolly, then turned on his heel and walked away. Behind him, he could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers starting among the guests who had noticed the exchange. He didn't stop. The music swelled, the party continued, but for Sarah and Josh, the night had taken a turn they hadn't anticipated. Mark's calm demeanor had delivered the ultimate blow. He didn't need to raise his voice or cause a scene. The truth was now out in the open, and the fallout had only just begun the moment Mark turned and walked away. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She stood frozen for a few seconds, clutching the envelope tightly as if it were a lifeline. Josh glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and concern, but his detached smirk suggested he didn't think much of the situation. "Excuse me," Sarah mumbled, her voice shaky. Without waiting for a reply, she hurried after Mark, weaving through the crowd, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Mark, wait," she called, catching up to him just as he reached the quieter foyer outside the ballroom. Her breath was uneven, and her hands trembled as she held the unopened envelope. "What is this? What's going on?" Mark turned slowly, his expression calm but unyielding. "Read it," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Mark, please, this isn't what you think," she blurted out, her voice rising in desperation. "Josh doesn't mean anything to me. It's complicated, okay?" Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Complicated," he repeated, his voice soft but cutting. "Sarah, I've been watching this unfold for weeks. Don't insult me by pretending there's some deeper meaning here." Her eyes filled with tears, panic etched across her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she pleaded. "It's just, you've been so busy, and I felt so alone. He was just a distraction. I love you, Mark." Mark's gaze didn't waver. "You made your choice," he said firmly, his voice devoid of anger but full of finality. "This is mine." Sarah opened her mouth to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his statement was like a physical blow, and she realized there was no arguing her way out of this. Back in the ballroom, the whispers had started. A few co-workers had noticed the exchange, Sarah chasing after Mark with a distressed look, and speculation was already spreading like wildfire. Josh, initially unbothered, was beginning to feel the pressure. His casual confidence started to crack as more eyes turned in his direction. "Is everything okay, Josh?" someone asked, their tone more curious than concerned. Josh forced a smile, adjusting his tie. "Yeah, just some personal stuff," he muttered, but his voice lacked the usual smoothness. He could feel the scrutiny intensify his reputation, carefully built on charm and authority. Suddenly at risk, meanwhile, Sarah returned to the ballroom, the letter still unopened in her trembling hands. Her co-workers avoided meeting her gaze, their conversations hushed but unmistakably about her. The humiliation was suffocating. She glanced at Josh for support, but he was already distancing himself, keeping his interactions short and avoiding her eyes. The man she had risked everything for was now acting as though she didn't exist. Mark's calculated move had done more than just end their marriage. It had exposed Sarah and Josh for what they were. As the night went on, the whispers only grew, leaving Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. Alone and ashamed, Mark didn't waste time after the party. The next morning, he called his lawyer and filed for divorce, ensuring that Sarah's actions were documented in every detail. The evidence he had painstakingly collected, texts, timestamps, and overheard conversations, painted a clear picture of her betrayal. Mark's calm, meticulous approach left no room for doubt or counterarguments. He wasn't interested in a drawn-out fight. He simply wanted closure. The separation was clean, but emotionally cutting. Mark chose not to confront Sarah further. He didn't hurl accusations or indulge in bitter arguments. His silence spoke louder than words. His dignity remained intact, while Sarah floundered under the weight of her crumbling reputation. The fallout for Sarah was swift and brutal. At work, the whispers from the party spread like wildfire. Josh, sensing the threat to his reputation, began distancing himself from her. Once a charming and supportive boss, he now acted aloof, treating her as just another employee. The colleagues who once admired Sarah started avoiding her, their judgment evident in the way they spoke about her behind her back. Her personal life suffered just as much. Friends who had admired her seemingly perfect marriage with Mark were now appalled. Family gatherings became awkward, with relatives either avoiding her altogether or subtly expressing their disappointment. The isolation was suffocating, and for the first time, Sarah was forced to confront the depth of her mistakes. Mark, meanwhile, found a sense of liberation. With the divorce finalized, he set out to rebuild his life, not as a man defined by betrayal, but as someone who had reclaimed his independence. He began rediscovering the hobbies he had once abandoned, like painting and hiking, finding joy in the simple pleasures that had been overshadowed by his marriage's collapse. He also reconnected with old friends, realizing how much he had neglected his social life while trying to maintain his strained relationship with Sarah. Their support helped him heal, and their encouragement reminded him of the person he used to be. Slowly but surely, Mark began to feel like himself again. As the months passed, Mark's focus shifted from his past to his future. He started dating again, cautiously but with optimism. The pain of Sarah's betrayal had dulled, replaced by a sense of hope. He realized that her actions didn't define his worth or his capacity to love and trust. Sarah, on the other hand, faced a long road of regret. Without Mark, her life felt hollow. The excitement she had chased with Josh had turned into a series of losses. Her marriage, her reputation, and even her career trajectory. Josh's indifference stung the most. He had moved on effortlessly, leaving her to bear the brunt of the consequences alone. Mark's calculated revenge wasn't about ruining Sarah's life. It was about taking control of his own, and in doing so, he had left her to face the natural consequences of her actions. The satisfaction didn't come from her downfall, but from knowing he had walked away with his integrity intact and his life back on track. Looking back, Mark realized that Sarah's betrayal, as painful as it was, had taught him invaluable lessons about himself and about relationships. He had loved her deeply and had given everything to their marriage, but he also understood now that love without mutual respect and trust was a fragile foundation. Mark chose to share his story not out of bitterness, but as a lesson for others. If something feels off, trust your instincts, he explained to his audience. I ignored the signs at first because I wanted to believe in the best version of Sarah. But love doesn't mean turning a blind eye to the truth. He spoke about the importance of self-respect, urging viewers to never settle for a relationship where their value is taken for granted. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, he admitted. But it was also the most empowering. Staying would have meant losing myself. Mark's journey wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about healing, growth, and the courage to rebuild. He found strength in rediscovering his passions and in the connections he rekindled with friends and family. Through his story, he hoped to inspire others to face betrayal with dignity and to prioritize their own well-being. Sometimes, he concluded, walking away is the strongest thing you can do. It's not about revenge or making someone else pay. It's about choosing yourself when someone else fails to. And trust me, it's worth it. With those words, Mark closed the chapter on Sarah and their marriage, not with resentment, but with a clear sense of peace and purpose. The pain had shaped him, but it didn't define him. He was ready for the next chapter, stronger and wiser than before. Thank you for watching, and thank you for letting me share my story. If you found this meaningful or think someone else might need to hear it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. This is Unheard Stories, where real life teaches us the strongest lessons. I'll see you next time. Unheard Stories, where truth meets strength.